Hunter, have you ever been to New York City?
I have. I was there last August. It was the last time I was in New York City.
And you're broadly from the Northeast, right?
I am. I grew up about 100 miles away from New York City.
And so if I were to say, this can be fun. It's a nice callback from when I was actually a student of yours, and maybe actually hints at sort of a future episode. But if I were to say, I'm going to the city,
Hmm.
what would you think?
If I'm talking to my friends from the East Coast and I say I'm going to the city and we're in any city on the West Coast, they know that I'm talking about New York City.
It's fun. It's like a fun word association game, right? I think I'm originally from like the LA area. I mean, I'm actually from LA proper, so it would be kind of weird for me to say I'm going to the city. Nobody really says that, and people would say I'm going to LA.
Mhm.
I've had some friends who are from the Bay Area, and like sort of maybe in Oakland or something. They say they're going to the city. People typically think, oh, San Francisco.
Mhm.
I think broadly, if you start getting the farther east you go, the more the city means New York City.
I think that's true.
Is that right? Well, listener, if you can't tell where we're going with this, we are, going to start talking about New York City to, an insane degree. Actually, it's not going to be that much. I will, before we dive in, I will say broadly, we are not going to do, the city justice with our single part episode today. Super high level. But really the topic is, well, what if New York City was its own country, or really what if it was a country today? And this, if you don't know, and if you haven't already watched our sort of rebranding announcement, this is our final sort of branded what if episode. After this,
Right.
we're not necessarily going to do this exact same framing device anymore. We might do what if speculation here and there. Some topics will sort of flow into them a little bit better. But overall, sort of we're casting off that, whatever mantle, and sort of moving into sort of a new direction. So this will be the last one, and we are, I think, both pretty excited about it. I think I'm very excited about it.
I like to talk about New York. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, with that said, welcome to Geography is Everything, the podcast where we talk about everything just through a geographic lens. And you might be thinking for a quick second, well, does geography actually mean everything? And I'm only going to do this for the first couple episodes. And so I'm just going to say yes. No more questions. No, the only reason why I say that is because typically, and I think this happened with our plastics episode, we had our episode on plastics, and I think we had a comment in, I don't know, maybe it was Twitter or something. There, somebody was like, well, plastic isn't, like, the episode isn't really geographic, or it wasn't, or plastic isn't really geography or something like that. And I was like, well, it is though, right?
It's totally geography. Absolutely. I mean, I totally understand why somebody would say that, right? Mm-hmm. Because, you're thinking that plastics are chemistry or something else. And that would be true too, right?
Right.
But the way that I think that we looked at things over those couple episodes, we were talking about how some ideas about how to make a new substance start in one place and spread to other parts in the world, and how it's become a very important substance phenomenon throughout the world. And now wherever you go in the world, you can find plastic. That's incredibly geographical.
Yeah. I mean, you can go to the bottom of the ocean and find plastic, sadly, today. So, I think it really is a way of us just talking about things. And so, like I said, I'll probably do this a couple more times through the first few of our new branded episodes, but hopefully that questions or that sort of comment starts to die down a little bit. With that, let's do some introductions. Hunter.
I'm Hunter Shobi. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University. I'm also the co-author of a couple cultural atlases, Portlandist, a cultural atlas, and Upper Left Cities, a cultural atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle, which I co-authored with David Banis and a whole crew of different people, including yourself, Jeff, were involved in that. And glad to be back here as co-host of this newly branded podcast.
All right. Yeah. And my name is Jeff Gibson. You probably know me from the YouTube channel called Geography by Jeff, That's where you can sort of find all of my sort of, YouTube content, various videos where I just sort of talk about whatever sort of strikes my fancy at any sort of time of, whatever I figure out. I'm also, the co-host of this podcast, which has been really fun and exciting. And I also write at a Substack newsletter that was also formerly branded as Geography by Jeff and has now also been rebranded to Geography is Everything, because that Substack newsletter is becoming a more of a collaborative effort between me and Hunter. And so I think broadly, if you're really a super fan of this podcast, which I do think we have a few super fans. I don't know who you are, but thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you both.
if you are a super fan, you really like what we do, you really like listening to us talk, I really highly encourage you to go to geographyiseverything.substack.com, subscribe to it. It's free. So you just have to put in your email, because for one, the podcast that we're recording now will still be on YouTube. It'll still be on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, what have you. But now it's also going to be on our Substack newsletter, which means that one, you get a sort of ad-free experience on Substack. And that's, I can't promise that forever, but for now, that's what it's going to be. Two, you get to sort of interact with us a little bit more intentionally, right? So, before, like, we would sort of push out this podcast to the world, and then aside from social media, Twitter, Instagram, the like, there wasn't really a lot of ways for us to interact with people. And, certainly the people who are commenting on, on social media, we don't know if they're actually a fan or if they just sort of stumble upon it. And I think the best part about all of this is that the Substack newsletter not only has, some extra articles that I write about geography, and Hunter's going to contribute as well in the future. But we're also able to now do something which I think is going to be really cool, which is a new sort of mini episode series that's going to be exclusive to our Substack community. So, once a week-ish, we haven't figured out the cadence yet, but once a week-ish, there's going to be an extra little mini geography episode that's sort of broadly about sort of a concept, a geographic concept. They should be really fun. Not a lot of, it's probably, 15-ish minute episodes, but if you really like sort of what we do, that's going to be the place to catch those. And you want to hear us, more, then subscribe. And we're here to offer you all your geographic needs for the week.
And let us know what you're interested in. And that's another way for us to be able to hear from people who are engaged with the podcast, and with some of the things that we're producing. And if there's things that you want to hear about, then we can find that out, and we can do our best to try to make that an episode, try to make that one of the, or one of the conceptual mini episodes, or we can write about it. So it's a way for us to deliver back what people are interested in.
Yeah, I would say the best part about having the Substack community, and I'm getting very close to just sounding like an ad for Substack here, but I would say the best part is, like, we can sort of build a community of people who like our content, and we can sort of, this doesn't have to be a one-way street anymore. This can be more of a two-way sort of relationship, whatever you want to call it. So we're really excited about it. That said, like I had mentioned, you can still watch this on YouTube. We would love to see you on YouTube. In fact, if you are watching this on YouTube right now, you are probably noticing something a little bit different, and that you can see us high, because we have decided to record ourselves over Zoom, and make it so that the YouTube videos are a little bit more dynamic. If you're just listening on one of the dozen podcast apps, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, XYZ, awesome. We still love having you.
That's great too.
Yeah, you're not getting anything less by listening there for our main podcast. Aside from, I guess, you can't see us because that's just not how podcast apps work. So, you're more than welcome to continue listening there, listening on those apps. Our once a week, every Wednesday episode will always be on every single podcast app you can possibly think of. And that said, if you are on Apple Podcasts, please review us. We really appreciate it when you do. I always say this, I'm not sure if it helps or anything, but it makes me feel good when I see another 5-star come in. And it, if it's going to be a 1-star, I don't know, maybe just pause, maybe just stop listening. You have the power. Right. I guess with that, let's go ahead and jump into today's episode. We had already talked about it broadly. What if New York City became its own country today? Right.
And so we're not dealing with what would it take for that to happen, really. We're just
No.
talking about, what would be different? What would the world look like? What would the United States look like? What would New York look like if New York City was its own country? So not necessarily, and it's not a very likely scenario, but I think it's very interesting to think about.
No, I think, again, we're not going to get into how this might happen. There's too many variables that go down to honestly some pretty dark areas of, thought. I don't really want to entertain that. I just kind of want to talk about it sort of broadly. In a lot of ways, it's pretty parallel to Singapore. One point Singapore was part of Malaysia, and then through sort of a swift, pen signature, it became its own independent country. That's all we really need to do in order to sort of justify this episode. So yeah, broadly, what if it became its own country today? We're going to sort of run through what that might look like, how that might look like. We're going to talk a lot about city states today, for the obvious reason that New York City as its own country would be a city state. Not a whole lot of rural agricultural land. But before we do that, as I always like to do whenever we're talking broadly about a very specific piece of land, a land acknowledgement, right? The physical land that New York City exists on today, sort of was the native home to Native American tribes, principally the Algonquin Native Americans. I think specifically a specific tribe called the Lenape.
When we're also talking about areas of land, Native First Nations people, Native Americans don't always sort of conform to the kind of geographies that Europeans made maps about. And so,
Sure.
It's important to sort of acknowledge that things may have changed over time, that when we're talking about this place, we know that we're talking about a place that was for millennia before the city existed, was the land of other groups of people. And we want to make sure that, we put that out there first and foremost, that, we're aware of that, and that's an important thing to acknowledge to start.
Right. Right. And so I guess with that, let's talk a little bit sort of why New York City. And I think this is going to lead into our conversation, or sort of our historical conversation a little bit. But, New York City as a whole has, one, it's the United States' most populous city. It's also had an incredible impact on the United States as a whole. And we're going to touch on this sort of super high level very briefly. It's been very impactful for a lot of different reasons, and we're not going to do it justice in our 1 hour-ish episode today. Simply
we can't talk about everything here, but we can highlight certain things. And again, that's what the podcast sort of does, is we can touch the surface here and kind of get you thinking about different things. And in the future, we could go deeper into certain aspects of that if that's what people are interested in.
Right.
But an overview of, it's certainly not exhaustive or comprehensive, but we want to touch on some of the important themes related to this idea about how New York functions, how it functions in the country, how it functions in the world, and what would it be like if it were recognized independently.
Exactly. So with that, let's jump into our history, right? So we're going to start off with some, I guess, early-ish history of New York City. We're not going to go back into the tribal history, but earliest history as a colony, right? And I think most people, especially those who aren't from New York City or maybe the Northeast, probably don't realize that New York City has not always been called New York City. In fact, it wasn't even founded by the English. Hunter, who was it founded by?
Well, it was a Dutch colony to begin with. And so the city that we now call New York started as New Amsterdam.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, it was New Amsterdam, which is, I'm not going to say that I don't like the name New York City, because I think it's fine. It's whatever. But New Amsterdam. That's kind of a cool city name. I'm kind of disappointed they got rid of it.
Well, I mean, it's a very colonial type thing to come
It
into a
is.
place and say, this is the new place where we came from, right?
Oh, it's
And
very, very colonial.
right. And so that's the sort of imperial colonial history. And we still have that. And it reflects that we're, instead of talking about Amsterdam, we're talking about York. And that sort
Mhm.
of, tracing that history talks about the development from a Dutch colony to an English colony.
It was funny. This is sort of a total tangent, but I had recently did an episode on YouTube about Toronto, Canada. And Toronto, Canada, when it was first founded as a city, town, whatever, it was just called York. And there is now another York sort of in that general area, but this was actually on the side of Toronto today. During the War of 1812, it got burned down, yada, yada. Anyways, Canadian British people rebuilt it. And at that point, it was still called York, but they decided to rename it Toronto after the local indigenous tribes. So it kind of makes you think like what would have happened had, American, whatever United States colonists had decided to go a similar route. What would it be called? Right. That's a whole other what if scenario, but it just sort of triggered a.
Well, it makes me think of, again, not to get too far afield here, but it makes me think of Seattle a little bit, because Seattle is a name of a Native American leader. However, it was the name that Europeans gave that leader. So
interesting.
It's the pronunciation would be different. And so Seattle references a leader of Native Americans, but this is a name that Europeans gave it. So that politics are reflected in the name of that city, for example.
Right. Anyways, okay, so let's get back to New York City. We're heading back over to the East Coast. So, so just to go back to sort of New York's early life as a Dutch colony, the Dutch really did try to grow New York City. It was sort of their first, I would say, North American, whatever colony, city, whatever you want to call it, outpost. But New York City, contrary to where it's at today, was not at all successful in the early years. Back in, I think New Amsterdam was in 1624. The Dutch had tried to grow it. I think during that first, I don't know, maybe even almost 100 years, it was pretty sluggish growth. I think I have here inside my notes that the Dutch, they were trying to get more colonists over there. Dutch, Netherlands, is a pretty small country. And so they instituted this patroon system where a wealthy Dutch citizen could bring, if a wealthy Dutch citizen brought 50 settlers with them, they would be awarded sort of a large tract of land with sort of a political autonomy. But it was a failure. It didn't really amount to anything. As it turns out, the Dutch people weren't as willing to move across the ocean as, say, maybe the Puritans, who were facing sort of religious persecution under the English or various other sort of European settlers, right? It was just not as enticing to them.
What's interesting is to comment here is that this granting of territory, though, is the mechanism by which Native Americans are displaced from this land. And all of a sudden, a new system comes in, a new power comes in, and there is this new idea that, you have a title to land, which is, of course, very alien to the way that things worked previously. And so even though the Dutch didn't, stay in power for that long, that's what initially disrupts the connection, between Native Americans and being able to be on this land, and Europeans come in and start to take over.
Yeah, can you imagine, like, you're just sort of sitting there, whatever, in your home, and somebody from, halfway across the world comes over and says, "Hey, sorry, our leader said that this is my land now, not your land."
Right. I have a piece of paper that says that, right? Like, yeah.
Which isn't a language that you can understand. It's just, it's totally, it makes no sense. Hindsight. Well, let's move ahead a little bit, just for the interest of time. So obviously we've talked about New Amsterdam sort of as a Dutch colony. Obviously at one point it became an English colony. And that is because the Dutch they ended up surrendering the city in 1664 to the English in a bloodless battle. So basically the English surrounded them, had basically said, well, I know you say this is, your city, but it's really going to be ours now. And they were willing to fight over it. And just like how the Dutch couldn't get enough settlers over there, they also couldn't really raise an army. So they kind of just said, okay, we're going to leave for a little bit. And so the English come in, they rename it to New York after the Duke of York, which is, obviously where all the Yorks get their name. And then during the Third Anglo-Dutch War in 1673, the Dutch actually recaptured New York. And so it's now been Dutch to English to Dutch again, and they renamed it. Do you know what they renamed it to, Hunter?
Tell me. I'm not sure that I do.
So this is its third name. It was named New Orange after the Duke of Orange, not the color, which the color might be named after the Duke of Orange too. I don't know. But it was named after the Duke of Orange. And for a very, very short amount of time. So after it was returned to England in, about a year, I think there was some money that changed hands. I don't think the Dutch ever really had any intent on keeping it for that second time. Again, the Dutch have a really interesting colonial history that's, while still pretty, awful, takes a little bit of different turns than a lot of the other countries, which we might get into someday. But I think all of this sort of builds to is that the early Dutch sort of history, the colonial history of New York City, really does have a profound impact on the New York City that we know today. If we think about the Netherlands and the Dutch as a country back then, they were very well known for their capitalist nature, right? There was all these various trading companies, Dutch East India Trading Company. I can't remember, something like that. A bunch of different things that the Dutch were really involved with in terms of the exchange of capital and goods, sort of globally. They might not have had a huge colonial empire, like the likes of France, Spain, England, et cetera, but they had a huge mercantile empire that, again, is, as we now look at New York City today, we can really kind of see that sort of historical roots within the city, right? I don't think there's another city that's quite as capitalistically minded in a lot of ways as New York City is, which is kind of interesting to think about, right? And this might, I like to think that there's a tie in there. Maybe there's not. Maybe I'm reading into it a little bit, but I do think it's an interesting sort of history there. I think with that, we are already at our first ad break.
Is it time already?
It is time already. Yes, we are at about 20 minutes. So with that, we're going to jump to some ads, and we will see you guys in a minute or two. Welcome back. We just finished sort of the early history of New York City, and now we're going to jump ahead to, we're done with England, we're done with the Netherlands, we're done with broadly Europe. We'll talk about Europe a little bit more down the road, but let's jump ahead to sort of New York City as we as we all know it today, which is as part of the United States of America. So we're going to jump to the sort of modernish history. So New York City, from 1800 to 1900, grew a tremendous amount. So if we go back to 1800, this would be shortly after the Revolutionary War. There was around 80,000 people living in the city, which was not a small city back then. In fact, that's kind of a big city. Maybe not compared to London or Paris, but like certainly for this side of the world, right? Yeah,
absolutely. And in fact, it's interesting, at the beginning of at the end of the 1700s, when the United States is first formed, Philadelphia is a bigger city than New York.
Right.
And then after several more decades, New York starts to eclipse the population of Philadelphia and then everywhere else in this new country of the United States. So
I have here in my notes.
It's the story of industrialization, right? I mean,
exactly. Right. So I have here in my notes, by 1900. Again, 1800, we're about 80,000. By 1900, we're at almost 3.5 million people. Like that is bar none. That's incredible growth. That's
dramatic growth.
Dramatic. Over 100 years, you're going to grow 50 times your size, something incredible like that. It's, I would say a city today, if a city's having 5% growth, it's in pretty solid territory in terms of growth year over year. Very rarely does a city grow like that anymore. Maybe some cities in, I don't know, China or India, that's all of a sudden has a new industry pop up in it or something like that. I wouldn't say certainly in the United States or Europe does that usually happen these days.
Well, this also corresponds with the rise of industrialization, industrialized agriculture, a huge population boom in Europe, and a lot of people not owning territory in Northern Europe, and that system of capitalism being the way to be successful, went someplace else. And we've already said this, taking over another territory. And so this corresponds with the period of incredible growth. I think, all throughout human history, up until around 1830, there were less than 1 billion people.
Right.
So it took all of human history until about 1830 to get 1 billion people. And then since then, we've added another 7 billion people to the
Right. Yeah. Which is, again, I mean, there's just a lot more people going around. Well, all that's to say is, there's a number of reasons for this. We can talk about a couple of them here. I guess jumping ahead to the sort of 1900s, 1916, New York City became sort of home to the largest urban African diaspora in North America as part of the Great Migration, right? So this would be a lot of Black people who had left southern states to escape, a wide variety of things. I think it started off, back before slavery happened. I know New York State was one of the early abolitionist states. I have in my notes that they, I think it was 1799 that they passed the first abolitionist law. I think it would be another couple of decades before that actually went fully into effect, but certainly pretty early on. But then the South also had a lot of antiquated, laws that still prevented Black people from doing almost anything. And New York, not perfect in this regard. I'm not saying that. But certainly better in a lot of ways. So a lot of people, African Americans, moved from the South and moved up north, which happened to a lot of cities, right? And we know Detroit and Pittsburgh and Philadelphia and New York and Boston all got a lot of people from the Great Migration.
And these are all industrial cities. So moving from an agricultural country to an industrialized country that does a lot of manufacturing, that helps explain that people are looking for jobs as well.
Right. And then there was another big wave that I think we're going to talk a little bit about on our potato episode. But we really can't separate New York from it. And that is the Irish famine. Famine, I should say, quote unquote. Because, and maybe we'll talk about this in our next episode on the potato, but the Irish famine was largely manufactured, right? There was, potato blight everywhere, but,
Well, I mean, the potato blight struck in North America, throughout Europe, but it became an actual famine in Ireland for all kinds of reasons that we'll talk about next week.
Right.
But one of the things that happened there was a lot of the people were living in a situation where they didn't own their own land. They were tenant farmers. And after moving to the cities in Ireland and not finding really any opportunity there, over 1 million people in the span of 7 years left Ireland, and many of them came to North America, most of them to the United States. And New York was one of the chief places where people arrived, and many stayed. And so, as we look at the industrialization of Europe, as people move off of the farms, move from rural areas, move to cities, find limited opportunities there, migrating to the United States is something that happened. And this happened subsequently. Northern Europe, Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, different parts of Asia, Latin America, Africa. And so this happens in waves that corresponds roughly when industrialization really starts to take hold in these different parts of the world.
Yeah, I have in my notes here that the Irish famine brought in more than 200,000 Irish immigrants to New York City alone. That's not to the United States or North America. That is just to the one city, which is a huge amount, right? So, this is well documented in a lot of different sort of films and books and everything. And Irish people at that time were not treated very well by American citizens or whatever, New Yorkers, however you want to classify them. They were very much thought of as a what's the word? But basically an other, sort of entity.
Yeah, they were second class citizens.
Second class citizens. There you go. That's exactly what I was looking for. But all of this is leading towards, and you've hinted on it a little bit already, Hunter. But this is all leading towards sort of this industrialization and it's sort of the first mega city sort of propping itself up within, well, certainly within North America. We'll kind of get to that in the world a little bit, but I just want to quickly talk very, very high level about sort of skyscrapers, right? And this is also a future episode of ours. So in the early 1900s, with all of these people sort of cramming into the city, there was a density of people, and as well as, industrial revolution happening, which brought along with it the steel industry, which brought about means to create these larger, taller buildings, right? New York City has, I would argue, the most famous skyline in the world.
Very iconic skyline.
Yeah, I can definitely picture other skylines in my head. I don't think I can definitely, absolutely picture the New York City one, out of any photo that anybody shows me. It's so iconic. It's on everything, right? It's very, very famous. And so, they started building these skyscrapers, and, there's this really fun book that I think dives into this a little bit more. We're going to touch on this a lot inside that future episode that's coming up in the next few weeks, but it's a book about the tallest building race within New York City. And so, in case you didn't know, it's called Higher by Neil Bascom. And it's about the race between the Chrysler building and the Manhattan Company building to see who could have the tallest building. And again, this was all happening during this time of explosive growth within the city, right? Going from, at this point, we're over 3.5 million, but New York today is many, many more times millions of more people. So there's a lot of people moving there. There's a need for housing. There's a need for commercial and office space. And, if we track back to that early history, New York City was very capitalistic, right? So there's a lot of business happening there. There's just a lot of economic generation happening right now. And all of this sort of culminated in skyscrapers popping up everywhere. As you sort of like look left and right, there's a new skyscraper popping up. And so this kind of, all culminates into sort of the city that we know today, which is New York City, and it has so much, it's almost overwhelming in sort of its mass and its size.
Yeah, certainly there is a competition for having large buildings and skyscrapers that happen within the country and globally as well. And that's really still going on in a lot of ways. And
yeah,
the idea is that by having this architectural feat, this feat of engineering, where you can have the tallest building, it's supposed to reflect upon the city in some way. And, the steel frame construction that you mentioned is part of what makes that possible. The other thing is that the invention of the elevator also made it possible, because, even in New York today, there's a lot of, structures that are maybe 5 stories high, 6 stories high, where there's no elevator. And that was the reality for a long time. And once the skyscraper comes along and you're able to build, at a much larger scale.
No, the elevator is huge in sort of the evolvement of taller buildings as well. And I didn't even really think about that. I'm definitely have to factor that into this skyscraper episode. But absolutely. So all this sort of stuff culminates into the wonderful city that we know today. But there's been a few other things. And again, we're going to get to the point where we're talking about sort of what New York City looks like today. But I kind of want to touch on 3 sort of cultural reforms. And like I said in the beginning, New York City what we're doing in this episode is not going to do New York City justice. We are high level. We're touching in some very high level cultural moments, historical moments, XYZ. There's so much to New York City, far more than this podcast can be. However, there's 3 events that I kind of want to touch on as cultural events, because they influence so much else inside the country, certainly within the United States. And I would argue one, certainly, globally. But the first is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. Hunter, do you know what that is?
I don't think that I do. Why don't you tell me what's going on?
So the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was a factory that made the garment of clothes called the Triangle Shirtwaist. I'm not sure if that was a brand or a type of clothing. It was basically a garment factory.
The garment industry, part of what drove industrialization.
Exactly, right. It probably more than almost anything else, right? There's those very early sort of, industrialized looms, I think they were. So back when this was happening, I think this was in the mid to late 1800s. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was churning out these garments, and a fire started. And it's mostly women who are working there. And there were a couple different exits, but one of the exits had been barred. And what it ended up happening was a lot of women ended up dying. There's some very horrific tales, oral history, or newspaper clippings of women sort of flinging themselves out of the building. These were 6-7 story buildings. Basically to their death. It was either that or be burned alive. And so this was a moment for the United States as well as New York City to pass basically some fire protection laws that didn't exist before. And that, again, this is a horrific story, not a good ending, but it does show that what was happening in New York City through tragedy still had an incredible impact on the country as a whole. Just in the interest of time, there could be a whole episode on.
Yeah, I mean, these are the tragedies that are repeating themselves around the world today. And,
exactly.
You can pick any country. Bangladesh, an enormous amount of manufacturing happens there, and it's a country that's had some terrible, terrible factory collapses and disasters where many people have lost their lives, and it speaks to the dark side of industry. And the lack of protections that there are sometimes for workers. And so, we'll have to get into that another time. But it does, early on in the history of the United States, what happens in New York has a huge impact on what happens in the rest of the country.
Right. And so I think, jumping ahead a little bit, actually, this is something we've already talked about in a previous episode, Hunter, but tenant laws around housing sort of first started in New York City. And Hunter, can you refresh us a little bit about that? If you haven't, listen to our episode on housing, which, hey, go do that.
So I mean, one of the things we talked about with that episode was the terrible also living conditions that a lot of workers found themselves in, and workers finding themselves sharing apartments with many people crammed into a room without proper ventilation, without proper access to light and to air, and fires and disasters that happened that took many people's lives. And the city sort of has to start creating some standards so that people are protected. And so this comes up with these laws that would dictate, that there have to be fire exits and there have to be provisions for this, and there has to be proper ventilation. And when these laws start to go in effect in New York, they start to reverberate, and many other cities start to have, they start to adopt this kind of view that there's a role for a city government to play to make sure that the people who are living in that city are protected in their homes.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you told me during that episode, which still haunts me to this day, was that there would be something like 20 people per one bathroom.
Yeah, I mean, that was an innovation at one point. They're like, well, for every 20 people, we should have a bathroom. So it was worse initially. And then that, I think that probably changed over time. But sanitation wasn't properly thought out. And it was speculation. It was like, let's get people working, and whatever we have to do to house them. And again, we have to recognize that this is the reality for some people in the world today.
Right. Totally.
And so, again, something that we can talk about more, but this is in the history of the United States. The history of New York figures prominently, and how people think about the relationship between a city and the residents of that city, and the protections for the residents.
Totally. Yeah. And the final thing I wanted to bring up, and again, there's a whole lot more that we could talk about, but the final one is the Stonewall riots. Which this is the one I was thinking of that probably had the most global impact. But this is really an event. It was a riot basically, and that started in New York City in what is this? I have in 1969.
69. Yep.
69. That really kicked off the gay liberation movement of sorts, right? And that has spun out into a lot of different areas of gender equality, or I wouldn't say, well, maybe it helped gender equality. It certainly didn't start gender equality, but I was going to say transgender equality, today, and like all of this other stuff. And while again, it was a bit of a tragedy, sort of spun out of sort of a tragedy.
This is a moment where people rose up, right? And so there were constant police raids, and this is the Stonewall Inn, and there were other bars and establishments where people were gay could have space, right, to congregate, except that they couldn't congregate without the specter of raids and police. And then what happened, and there's a lot that could be said about the history of this particular moment, but this is when individuals started to rise up and push back. And, the riot was really just the sort of the last straw. That said, we're not going to be, we're not going to tolerate this kind of treatment anymore, and we're going to stand up for that. And so that really did catalyze a more broad movement throughout the country, certainly. And and Pride Month, harkens back in a lot of ways to this sort of moment of standing up to have space for individuals to express themselves and to be who they are.
Exactly. And so for all of these reasons that we've sort of covered up to this point, and many, many, many more that we're not even talking about, that we're not even able to talk about, this is why New York City is particularly suited to this question of, well, what if it was a country? Because there's a lot there crammed into a very small space.
There's the economic, there's the manufacturing, there's the housing, there's the cultural impacts. And these are the things that we'll touch upon, because all of a sudden, one of the major economic, cultural, political touchstones of the United States would no longer be part of the United States.
Right. Exactly. So let's talk about New York City today. Right. So we're done with history. We're going to move on. Let's talk briefly about New York City. We'll get through some of this sort of kind of material before we launch into our what ifs. So New York City today. Hunter, do you know how many people live in New York City today?
I think I've looked this up, and I think it's something on the order of not quite 9 million, but closing in on 9 million.
Yeah, very close. Yeah. It's 8.9 million-ish people. I think a little bit on the higher end of that. So getting close to 9 million. I think it is shrinking. I think it's shrunk a little bit over the last couple of years, as a lot of cities have during this age of COVID. Within the metropolitan area, you're thinking a little bit more closer to 20 million. So that that's a huge huge area. That's a lot.
And
of
there's a handful of places in the world that are that big or bigger, but not a lot of them. And certainly in the United States, it's far and away not only the largest, but the most densely populated place in the United States.
We're going to talk about density in a little bit, because that's where things get a little bit, I would say, very interesting. So I guess just broadly, not even getting into our what ifs, but just to give people an idea of sort of what this means. Let's say New York City was its own state, right? So if it was its own state, not a country.
By state, we're meaning country, because state. No, sorry. In geography. I think it's good, because in geography we use the word state to talk about Canada, United States, Mexico, and it's not necessarily just California, New York, and Florida or something.
Yeah, but if it was country is what we're not a country, if it was a state within the United States, just to give you an idea, it would be given 11 seats in the House of Representatives, right? So a lot of states only have one. So it would instantly become one of the sort of highest populated states. And obviously, this goes without saying, but New York City today is very diverse. I won't get into the statistics, that exact breakdown, but it probably comes as no surprise here that it is not a majority any sort of race state or city, I should say. There's a lot of mixing of languages, cultures, nationalities, religions. It really is. We like to say the United States is a melting pot. It's not really all that true, I would argue.
I think that's the term we used to hear a lot. When I grew up, I heard that term a lot. And I think there's a big effort to get away from that, because it suggests that people are having to change to become something else. And, maybe a mosaic is an analogy that's sometimes used because it suggests that it's a combination of lots of different small pieces of people who get to sort of continue to be themselves and don't have to melt into something else. And that talks about assimilation and all of the problems that are associated with that.
No, that's a good point. So New York City really is a mosaic of all these different cultures, right? There's almost nothing you can't find in New York City. And just really quick before we talk, more about New York City as a country, but there are other city states in the world where we're already starting to talk about this concept of a city state. So, there's Singapore, which we've already mentioned. It's probably the most obvious and most example. It's another very dense, highly populated city. There's also Monaco, and then there's Vatican City, which is a whole other thing.
Yeah, I mean, the Vatican has a very close relationship to Italy and to Rome. It's dependent on Italy and Rome in various ways, and so it's a pretty unique situation, I think.
It's interesting. Another episode. So the size of New York City. So again, it's just talk a little bit about it today. It's about 472 square miles. That's the city itself, not the metro area. So that's not, I wouldn't say that's small, but it's certainly, it's not a large area, especially for how many people who live there. So, it would be larger than Singapore. I have that in my notes. And it would be actually larger than quite a few countries, official countries. I have here in my notes, it would be the 171st largest country in the world.
I think the United Nations recognizes on the order of 193-ish countries. So that means that there would be at least 20 countries that would have a smaller population.
Right. But if we start talking about, so we already talked about population, right? 8.9 million people. I have here in my notes, that'd be 99th largest country in the world. So again, that's quite a jump up. It's, I have it here. It's ahead of Switzerland, for example. But if we start talking about population density, this is where things get a little bit more interesting. So New York City, the city itself, again, this is not the metro area, just talking about the city, has a population density of around 29,000 people per square mile. That's a lot. That's a lot of people per square mile. I think anybody who's been to New York City knows and has felt sort of what that feels like. I happen to love it. Some people don't like it so much. But it would be, in this case, it would be the third densest in the world. So it'd be behind Macau and Monaco. And that's basically it. Ahead of Singapore, and basically ahead of, really, if you start thinking about any country, regardless of whether, it's Europe or, South Korea, India, Bangladesh, these very dense, what we think of as dense countries. If you really start thinking about them, you start realizing, oh, they are dense for a country, but they are also still really, really mammothly big. And there's still just a lot of empty space. And so that's kind of sort of how sort of the density plays into this, where we sort of, New York City, 99th largest in terms of population, 171st in terms of size, but the third densest country. A lot of people in not a very large area. And so, well, we're going to jump into our what ifs here in just a little bit, because I kind of want to move us along, but I do think we need to talk a little bit about the economy and industry for a hot minute, because it's going to factor so much into our what ifs. I'll just go ahead and say it. If the GDP of New York City, just the city today, is $886 billion per year as of 2021. That is an incredible GDP for a city. It is the wealthiest city by GDP, which again, and Hunter, we've talked about GDP a little bit. Just sort of, there are caveats that go with GDP. It does not measure.
It's an average per capita. It's a per capita measure, right? And so it doesn't necessarily describe anybody, but it's more taking it's a per capita statistic that gives us an ability to measure different places in the world. And so it doesn't necessarily speak to the division between the gap between rich and poor, or how many people are wealthy. But it is a basic way of sort of measuring the economy.
Right. And so I have here that, per the GDP, which again, as we sort of discussed briefly, is a, flawed method, but per the GDP, it would be the 19th wealthiest country in the world, ahead of Saudi Arabia, but below, and I found this kind of funny, just below the Netherlands, which, it's just kind of funny given New York City's origins as New Amsterdam.
But that's, to be the 19th wealthiest country, I mean, that's a massive economy. And of course, not everybody's benefiting equally from that wealth, but just as a raw measure, it allows us to situate New York as being economically extremely powerful spot.
Right. And so with that, because I want us to get to our what ifs and we're already lagging here on time a little bit, we're going to jump to an ad break first, and then we'll get to our what ifs. And we're back. So we have done New York City no justice at all. It's just so hard, 45 minutes to talk about
a single episode to talk about this fantastic city.
If it was 2 episodes, it still wouldn't be enough.
No, you could have infinite episodes. I mean, there are podcasts about the city, right?
Right.
And so,
exactly. So we're just acknowledging that. But let's talk a little bit about we've talked about sort of what it would look like as a country. Now let's talk about sort of the what ifs. What if New York City was a country? And again, we're not talking about how this might happen. We're not talking, what would it take? All of that, becomes sort of just a little bit of a quagmire, and you sort of get lost down that. Really, it's just, we're just going to flip a switch, and now today it is a country. And so, Hunter, what if New York City was a country?
Well, I mean, the first thing that I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about a country being established is that it's got borders with other countries. So all of a sudden, New York would be this country completely surrounded by the United States. Right. And there's an enormous amount of commuting that goes on from Connecticut and New Jersey in particular into New York. So these people who are going on a daily basis to Manhattan or wherever they're going in the city would suddenly be crossing an international boundary on a daily basis in order to go to work.
Yeah. And there's this is not without precedent, right? We know, for example, again, we're going to keep using Singapore as an example because, again, it's the most light comparison, but a lot of people who work in Singapore actually live in the nearest city in China, which is, oh, shoot, I'm spacing on it. Zhanjiang, I think. Anyways, it's another major city. It's not as wealthy as Singapore is. So a lot of the jobs end up being in Singapore and, not China, Malaysia, not Chinese city, Malaysian city. Anyways, a lot of people end up commuting into Singapore, and, they have to go through a expedited customs system. And we see this a little bit in the United States as well. So we're here in the Pacific Northwest. If you travel up to Vancouver, there's a border control. However, there's a pass system. I think it's called Nexus, where people who have this, who basically are people who do a lot of business in between the two countries, can sort of fly by the customs, right? I don't know if they can, if they have any sort of delay. It seems like they just sort of fly through. I'm not sure exactly what all goes into that, but there is a system in place so that people can travel with a greater sort of, amount of freedom.
There was a time where you could go to Canada without a passport from the United States. You could have a driver's license. That's not happening anymore, but it makes you wonder what kind of controls they would put on to keep, to keep populations coming into New York, to keep generating what it makes for the city to work. A lot of people live in the city, but a lot of people don't. And, what would that look like? And so that's something that immediately comes to mind. And then sort of related to that is the question of transportation, because you have, Amtrak, Metro North, you have highways that are connecting New York with Connecticut, New Jersey, and places afar. And some people commute, from long distances in upstate New York. The rest of New York would also be another part of another country now. And so what is that? What are the highway systems? What kind of changes have to happen there? What kind of changes have to happen with the trains? And then JFK, if we're talking internationally, JFK, John F. Kennedy Airport, it's the busiest entry point to the United States. So there are more people who enter the United States through JFK than any place else. So all of a sudden, and a lot of people are coming to New York, but a lot of people are then going on to other places in the United States. So all of a sudden, they'd be arriving to another country in order to get to the United States. So that would be complicated. JFK and LaGuardia are both located in Queens and would no longer be in the United States. So it's interesting to think about how that would play out.
Yeah, I remember because this was an episode on my YouTube channel, and I remember looking at the various methods into New York, and I want to say, aside from that northern part, and I guess Long Island, which will be a conversation here in a minute, most entryways in terms of vehicle, train, what happens, and it has to go through a bridge or a tunnel, right?
That's right.
And in that way, again, not talking about those two just yet.
But we're talking about Manhattan specifically in that case.
Well, and even
right?
Staten Island. Staten Island has a couple bridges that you need to cross bridges to get into it, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And so in that way, it almost makes setting up borders a little bit easier, right? Because there are finite entry points, right? If you're taking Chicago, for example, and we were to say Chicago is going to be its own country. Well, Chicago probably has 1,000 entry points. Any little street at any sort of point sort of crosses over. Now, again, there's that northern border that New York now would share with, the rest of New York State, as well as Connecticut. And that would need to be regulated, but it's a much smaller area, which I think makes it a little bit easier for New York to become its own country because of the sort of the geographic landmass system, being on this peninsula, being on sort of this island.
But there's still Brooklyn and Queens and the Bronx, which you can enter into on, there's multiple entry points there. Easier to enter into those places than to Manhattan or Staten Island.
Right. Well, I think isn't Queens and Brooklyn, aren't they? Isn't there like water that you wouldn't be able, aside from Long Island, right? Long Island would be the entry point, I think. Or maybe I'm way. We're gonna Google Maps this for a second. But
I just did the drive pretty recently from Connecticut.
Oh man, I thought for sure you would have to go over bridges to basically enter it, aside from, again, that northern border in Long Island. But anyways, I think the point is that I was trying to make is that there's a lot of traffic does go through very specific points, which I think right now would be more like choke points, grid congestion, all that kind of stuff. But if this was to all of a sudden be its own country, it would serve more as border control points. What are you looking at here?
Yeah, no, you have to cross, part of the Long Island Sound or the area that becomes the Long Island Sound. So yeah, I see what your point is, that there's more limited entry points into the city, less so for the Bronx. Which is that Queen, northern. For the Bronx, less so, that would be the case. But for Brooklyn and for Queens, that's more the case as well.
Yeah, which then begs the question of, okay,
although from Long Island becomes the special case a little bit, right?
Exactly.
That's more connected to Brooklyn and Queens by land than Connecticut is, for example.
Right. So this thing goes to that question of, well, what happens to Long Island, right? So if we're only taking the city of New York, which is only the 5 boroughs, which is Staten Island, Queens, Brooklyn, Manhattan, and the Bronx, Long Island is not part of that.
Right. Long Island becomes an exclave.
Really, it does. Yeah. I mean,
of the United States. Yeah.
There's almost 2 scenarios. If this did actually happen, one is, it becomes this exclave. It becomes this kind of weird-ish area, which isn't uncommon, right? Over here in Washington State, we have a very small exclave called Point Roberts that is connected to Canada directly by land, but is not connected to the U.S. by land. And there's a whole geographic story for why that is. So there's that scenario. The other scenario is, well, Long Island would probably just go with New York. If this actually did happen, logistically, it would probably just be assumed into New York just by nature of how it's connected. Probably, maybe. I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, it's an interesting question. But if we're talking strictly about, if our scenario is strictly New York City,
right,
then technically speaking,
then it's not.
Long Island is part of the metropolitan area, but not really truly part of the city? I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know what
I don't
happened.
know. Yeah, it's an interesting question.
Well, since we're talking about all these different parts of, the five boroughs and all this, what's the capital of New York City then?
Great question.
Right. If New York City is a country and it has to have a capital, I mean, is there a capital then? What
I,
gets to
I
be
I
that?
talked about this in my video about sort of what that would look like, and sort of I think the most obvious example or most obvious solution is that the current, mayor, New York City mayor, and city commission becomes sort of the president and sort of legislative body, and sort of wherever they hold that today continues to be where it's held nationally, quote unquote, which is I think in Manhattan. And so I think that's probably what would happen. But I think this becomes an interesting discussion of, okay, New York City is really five boroughs, which used to be independent, right? Brooklyn used to be its own city. Queens used to be its own city. Manhattan used to be its own city, XYZ. Do those then become sort of states, right? Their own internally governed things, which they kind of do have their own internal governance, right? I know there's the Brooklyn borough president. I'm not sure how much power that person has. Do you know how much power those people have? I have no idea.
Yeah, I'm not sure how that works. The
Yeah,
politics of New York.
it's
I'm
wild.
sure people who are listening are like, are you kidding me? This is the way it would work. But that's one of those things where you can, if you live in the city, you know about it. And if you don't, maybe you don't.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, there's probably some sort of internal mechanism to give people sort of regional representation. I don't know what if they have anything like that. In other city states, Singapore doesn't really have a democratic system of sorts. I think my geography knowledge is failing me, but I believe that they are still, more dictator-y. Maybe. I don't know. We can talk about that later. All that's to say is I think the boroughs, become more prominent. I also think there's a question here, if New York City became its own country, would all the boroughs want to be, part of the New York City country? Or would, some boroughs, like the Bronx maybe want to maintain as part of the United States? And I think there's a question around that, because I do know within New York City that people who live in Brooklyn or Queens or what have you, don't always agree with what's happening in other boroughs. And I know this from friends who live there.
Well, you wonder, I mean, to what point in New York does becoming its own country, does that unify people in New York more, or does it further amplify the differences between the different boroughs? And people in New York would probably have a pretty good opinion about that if you live in New York.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure. But when a country becomes independent, what does that do to the different parts of that place that becomes independent? That's a really interesting question. Apparently, for Singapore, by the way, it's a parliamentary representative democratic republic. But there is, I think, one party that sort of is dominant.
Oh, okay. So it's okay.
I'm not exactly sure what that system is like, but just as a small point of clarification.
Yeah, thank you. I had heard, so I think at one point it was a dictatorship, and I've heard that they still have some like pretty strict laws around various things. Like, somebody told me once, like, don't chew gum and spit it out into the sidewalk. That is
that's like a different
no.
That's a little bit of a different. That's a more of a not related to a form of government, but a culture of enforcing particular rules and things like that, which might be sort of a different thing. Apparently, I think it's a variation on a democracy, and of course, democracy is a continuum, and
it's not a light switch.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think I don't know. We're at about an hour already, if you can believe it. Do you have any more what ifs that you want to run through here?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's some other things to think about. I mean, it's just interesting to think about, for example, that New York is one of the media centers of the United States and one of the media centers of the world as well. You have the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, which are both published there. The New York Times is often regarded to be the paper of record in the United States, which means, it doesn't mean that it's always true or anything, but that it becomes sort of a way of chronicling what happens not only in New York, but in the country. And so how do those media outlets start to function differently if they become part of an independent country instead of part of the United States? That's something that I wonder about.
I have a solution for the New York Times. So if New York City becomes independent and the New York Times wants to still be the newspaper of record for the United States, what all they need to do is become the Newark Times.
Right.
Sorry, I had to do it.
I mean, it's a global place, so maybe it's still, it has global coverage of certain things, although, better coverage of certain areas than others. So that's a question. The two largest stock exchanges in the world are in New York,
right?
The New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ. And so all of a sudden, those are not located in the United States. They're located in New York instead. You have this massive concentration of investment capital in New York City, which would be in a different country. Does New York City as a country use the US dollar, or does it coin its own currency? What does that do to the strength of the dollar? Or even if they use the US dollar, would that somehow change the way that the dollar is regarded internationally, and thus the strength of the dollar? That's something that I think about.
No, that's a really good one. I think if we can just pause really quick and expand on that a little bit more, because I wasn't even thinking about I've thought broadly about the impacts of, New York City leaving, the impact on sort of the United States. And, I think broadly, as I was thinking about it, well, New York City is very prominent as a city. It's a very powerful city, but the impact would be relatively minor because the US is so, so much bigger, has so much more prominence, obviously. But when we start talking about it in terms of the power of the dollar, for example, you're right? You can't really separate New York City and like the stock exchanges and the investment capital, which all trade in the US dollar and use it as the primary monetary sort of means. If all of a sudden they weren't using that, they moved away from it, or even maybe they're still using it, but they're not under the laws and regulations of the United States. I think that has some pretty dramatic impacts for the United States as a whole, things that we're not even able to, probably not even able to speculate about. I think there's some very geopolitical ramifications. There
are so many companies, so many banks, so many investment firms that are headquartered in New York City.
Right.
Then that's not part of the United States anymore. And then there's a cultural spinoff to this as well. And so it turns out that the headquarters to the National Football League, Major League Baseball, the NBA, the WNBA, the NHL, and MLS are all in New York City. And so you would have the headquarters of these, and some of these leagues involve Canadian teams, like a few Canadian teams. But all of a sudden, the headquarters of these cultural institutions and these big businesses would no longer be in the United States anymore. They'd be in the country of New York.
They would be New Yorkian. They would be. That's
so. Do those places still function as the headquarters, or is there a scramble among other cities in the country to take on the headquarters of these particular sporting, sporting organizations that exist in the United States? The NWSL, by the way, is headquartered in Chicago. So that's a sort of an outlier. So you could see Chicago and Los Angeles and other cities vying to become the place where, if you still wanted to have a headquarters in the United States for some reason, there would be a competition. It would change the complexion of business in the United States based on that alone, you would think.
Yeah. So I think that got me thinking, okay, New York City becomes its own country. I think we could say with probably 100-degree certainty that not every single business would want to stay headquartered in New York City. I think that's probably safe to say that some companies would want to move. Maybe a lot of companies would want to move to the United States and set up shop. In which case, what does that mean for what's the next New York City in the United States, right? If New York City can no longer have that mantle, no longer have that sort of cash within inside the United States, what city takes up that banner? And I think a lot of people would probably say Chicago, because it does have a stock market. It already has a lot of similarities. It's been, quote unquote, the second city for, 150 years now. But is there another city that potentially takes up that?
In my mind, there's no place that could possibly replace New York in the way that New York functions, and that those functions and those
dispersed,
they would disperse more. And I think Chicago, Los Angeles, Dallas, Washington, D.C., and a number of other cities become, fill in the gap for some of those places that if companies or organizations need to have a true headquarters out in the United States, and New York's not in the United States anymore, then those other cities fill in. But I don't think any one. It is. I mean, I guess I would also say Chicago would maybe attract a lot of that kind of action, but it's super interesting to speculate.
Yeah, no, I think I think it would be very interesting to see how really it's almost a question of, not so much of, well, what if, what would happen to New York City if it became its own country, but well, what would happen to the United States if New York City?
That's almost the bigger question in some ways, in my mind. New York is the entertainment capital, one of the entertainment capitals of the United States, along with Los Angeles. I mean, there's other places as well, but also of the world, right? And so, how does that shake out in terms of entertainment industries? The Statue of Liberty, if we're talking about symbolic things, the Statue of Liberty is this huge symbol of the United States, would no longer be in the United States. It would be in another country. There's so many things that are distinct. New York City has so many superlatives in the sense that is the most of this and the most of that, or has this much population of that. It has got the largest Jewish population in the entire world.
More so than even Israel, right?
22% of American Muslims live in New York City. It is the largest Muslim population in the Western Hemisphere. So there are all kinds of, different world religions, beliefs, ethnicities to which New York City is very important. And so it's interesting to think about that. New York City is also, as we talked about with the Stonewall riots, has been a really important place in the United States, and I think globally, for LGBTQ plus rights and movements. And so thinking about what shifts with that is another thing that comes to my mind. It's a tourist center of the world. It's a fashion center of the world. And so it makes me think that, New York City would continue to be New York. But as you suggested, I think that other cities in the United States react to this, and there might be some recasting of not only economies, but cultural identities that go along with New York all of a sudden not being part of the United States.
Yeah. No, I think there's a lot there. I think when we did this same episode on the Pacific Northwest, or Cascadia becoming its own country, one that was a little more sort of, for lack of a better term, cut and dry, right? Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, to an extent, already have a large piece of land. In a lot of ways, they would still look and act, like a whatever country, and a normal country. Being a city, there's a lot of other variables there. But I also think that pulling Oregon, Washington State, and British Columbia apart from their respective countries, Canada and the United States, is almost a little bit easier than New York pulling that away from the U.S. It's not, Portland and Seattle and Vancouver, very big and culturally prominent cities within each country, but not as intertwined. There's not so much iconography boiled into almost the basis of what the United States is, like there is with New York, right? Like Wall Street and stock markets and Statue of Liberty and, all these different things, all this different cultural iconography.
Broadway. Yeah.
Yeah. There's just so much there that it's almost like if this did happen, it would be so fundamentally different from the United States we know.
Well,
almost
then
like that would be the United States, and then the United States would have to rebrand.
Then there's the international dimension of this as well. So New York would have to establish diplomatic relations with the United States, and the United States would have to establish diplomatic relations with
embassies.
New York. Yeah. But then that sort of reverberates around throughout the world. The United Nations headquarters, would no longer be in the United States. It would be in the country of New York.
Mm-hmm.
And then, whenever a country becomes independent, they have to have some kind of security force. And, not every country has huge armies. Mm-hmm. New York happens to have one of the largest police forces of the world. I don't know if it's the largest, but it's one of the largest. There's approximately 36,000 officers of the New York Police Department. So that, that's sort of set up to have some kind of security there. But that's an interesting set of questions. And then there's the other thing that I think we should think about is that this would have a massive impact on the political landscape of the United States. New York City is a huge Democratic Party stronghold. Right. It is a place that a city hasn't voted for a Republican president in like decades and decades and decades. And so the Democratic Party in the United States, I think, would look a lot different, would probably be significantly weakened. The United States would have different politics. The other thing is that New York City, for the major parties, the Republicans and the Democrats in the United States, is one of the cities where an enormous amount of fundraising happens for those parties. And so how does that gap in does it still function there, or does that go on to other places? And how do the Democratic and Republican Party and the other parties in the United States, how do they react to New York not being part of the country, and the fundraising that those parties have to do would be transformed by New York leaving the United States?
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, I did think a little bit about the political ramifications. Like, again, New York State, for example, would probably, at least be a battleground state at that point. I mean, Buffalo and Rochester still, and Syracuse still very Democratic, but obviously it's a lot more, what's the word I'm looking for? Competitive for conservatives at that point. So what does that mean? How does that shift the overall political landscape? There's
the power of New York politicians in Washington, D.C., mm-hmm. which has probably been waning over the last several years several decades because of population changing. But that would be another big shift, and that sort of power center that the politicians from New York City have would be different. And all of a sudden, all those politicians from New York City, wouldn't be eligible to be president or whatever, because they'd be living in another country.
Right.
So that would change things as well. There would be a lot of people scratching their heads saying, what now? And these are all things that would have to be at least thought about and addressed if New York City were to become an independent country.
Yeah. When I first started thinking of this as an idea, I kept thinking, well, this is everything we're going to say is going to be so almost exactly word for word for our Pacific Northwest Cascadia country episode. And actually, I'm finding that there's actually quite a bit of differences here. I can't say that about every region. If we were to do every single region, I think they would end up looking a lot more like our Cascadia episode. But I do think New York has proven to be such an interesting place that it really does make for a lot of just a lot of changes.
There's 120 colleges and universities in New York, mm-hmm. right? And so all of a sudden, those would not be part of the United States educational system anymore.
Right.
New York has one of the largest public education systems on the planet, really. And so that all of a sudden would become separated from, of course, in the United States, there's a lot of more local control over education anyway. So that might not be quite as significant as it would be otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
If Paris were to become its own country. That's another entirely different thing, because it's a very centralized country. A lot of decisions that are made in Paris immediately affect, on education, for example, the rest of the country. And that's not quite true in the United States.
Right. At one point it might have been, but not anymore.
Yeah. I mean, there's just local boards of education, and states have a lot more jurisdiction over education in the United States than in countries like France or India, where education is highly centralized.
Right. Well, I think with that, we got to bring this one to a close, even though I'm sure we could keep going on about this, but we're about an hour and 20 here. So we could, honestly, it's such a fascinating topic. New York City, we're definitely going to revisit inside a future episode, just without the what if branding. And we're definitely going to talk a lot about it in our upcoming episodes on both the potato and or another future episode on the skyscrapers, I'm sure. Well, skyscrapers, absolutely. I'm sure we'll probably touch on, for the potato episodes. But Hunter, with that, let's do some pluggables.
Well, the first thing, and anybody who's listening won't be able to appreciate this quite as much, but I wanted to do a little plug for Milton Glassner's iconic I Heart New York symbol, which was designed for the tourist board in 1977. I'm Hunter Shobe, professor of geography at Portland State University and co-author of Portland is a Cultural Atlas and Upper Left Cities, a Cultural Atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle.
Yeah, my name is Jeff Gibson. You can find me on YouTube at youtube.com/geography by Jeff. You can also find both of us now on Substack, and that's at geographyiseverything.substack.com. That's the name of this podcast now that you're listening to. Geography is Everything. Everything else, social links, Instagram and Twitter, whatever. You can find those inside the show notes. We drop them down there now. In fact, you'll find all of these links inside the show notes. So feel free to click on those, and we'll see you around the web. Bye.
Thanks for listening. And for a few of you, thanks for watching as well.